Hi, I'm Hadley Robinson, the producer of Impromptu. Today, we have a special bonus episode for you. It features two of our Impromptu regulars, Shadi Hamid and Jason Willick, live in conversation at the Cascade PBS Ideas Festival. They sat down earlier this month with our colleagues from Post Reports, the daily afternoon podcast from the Washington Post newsroom. They all got pretty real in a conversation about the state of American identity today. They tackled questions like, does focusing on identity create more opportunities to understand each other, or does it make us more fractured? I was totally riveted, and I think you will be too. All right, here's the live episode from Seattle.
Hello.
Hi. Welcome to the Cascade PBS Ideas Festival. My name is Martine Powers. I host the Washington Post podcast, Post Reports, with my wonderful colleague here.
Hi, I'm Elahe Azadi, and along with co-hosting Post Reports, I'm also a media reporter at the Post. And Martine and I are thrilled to be here because we're going to be diving deep on a conversation that echoes ones that are happening all over the country right now.
Right, when you think of this moment, a politically tense campaign year, when wars are raging, we have campus protests that are spreading and escalating across the country. The undercurrent to a lot of what's happening right now is this concept of identity.
Yeah, the importance of identity has gained more prominence in our cultural, but also our political discourse. But Martine and I are curious, what are the ramifications of that? Are we elevating more voices and creating opportunities for understanding, or are we becoming more fractured as a nation?
These are questions that come up a lot for Elahe and myself as we are covering the news every day. So we wanted to turn to two of our colleagues on the opinion side who have been grappling with answers to those questions.
So our guests today are Washington Post opinion columnists. First, we have Shadi Hamid. He is a member of the Post editorial board and an assistant research professor of Islamic studies at Fuller Seminary. Shadi, we're so happy you're here.
Thanks so much for having me.
And yes, give it up for Shadi. And we're also delighted to have Jason Willick. He writes a regular column for Post Opinions on legal issues, political ideas, and foreign affairs. Hello, Jason.
Thanks.
Welcome. We're psyched to be here.
Yeah, so I wanted to first start by asking you, Shadi, because as I understand it, you have shifted your thinking, which is it's interesting in of itself for someone to shift their thinking about something that's very important to them, about the role that identity should or does play in how we respond to these global events as Americans. And that really shifted for you after October 7th, the Hamas attack on Israel. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So before October 7th, I was a critic of identity politics, or what one might call wokeness in scare quotes. We can debate about that term. But I was someone who, I didn't always like to have my own identity in the foreground. I saw myself not necessarily primarily as an Arab or a Muslim, although I am those things. I saw myself primarily as a writer or an analyst who happened to be Muslim or happened to be Arab. And I think that I bristled at the idea that people could define me just based on things that I was born with and didn't really have much control over, an ethnic identity or a racial identity. And you know, I didn't have a big problem being the only brown person or only Arab person in the room. I didn't feel like it was super important if there was one of us or two or three. I was more interested in the people in the room, what are their ideas, than what their identity descriptors were. But I think post-October 7th, I'm finding my own Arab and Muslim identity more in the foreground because so much is revolving around where we sit or where we stand on the Israel-Gaza war and everything that comes with it. And I think this is really one of the most momentous shifts, really. I mean, post 9/11 was a big deal, obviously,
right.
And it defined me. That was my generation. I was a freshman in undergrad when 9/11 happened. That's why I decided to really go into politics, to become a writer. So I was forged kind of in that crucible, so to speak. But I think October 7th is another one of those realignment moments that really shifts or changes or shapes how we look at the world. And I think that I become more sympathetic to some of the identity politics stuff, the idea that sometimes there is an oppressor and an oppressed. It can be simplistic, but I do see the Palestinians and the Palestinian people as being a marginalized community, to use that lingo, but they are being oppressed by the Israeli military in what I would consider to be an unusually brutal war. And so I think that kind of framing can be helpful. Sometimes you got to be clear about that. Sometimes people are being oppressed, and it doesn't have to be so complicated, although obviously the broader conflict is, but at a very basic level, I think there's something fundamental there about a people that is struggling for statehood, for survival, to be recognized in a very basic way, and to live, to be able to live in their own land. So I think that has become more present for me. And I think it's also true that people can sort of guess where I so if you're Arab or you're Muslim, chances are you're going to fall in the pro-Palestine camp. I don't love these descriptors, but it's a reasonable guess. So someone might say, well, Shadi, you're falling back on identity politics. You're kind of holding on to your predictable, you're sort of filling in a certain kind of tribal identity.
Or like that your identity is dictating where you fall.
Yeah, that's what a lot of people say to me, like, oh, Shadi, you're letting your Arabness or your Muslimness get the better of you. You're just kind of going along with what we would predict. That's what people who criticize me say. I say, well, look, I don't think there's anything distinctly Arab or Muslim about recognizing that the Palestinian people deserve not to be killed. I mean, there's obviously a lot of non-Arabs and non-Muslims who feel very passionately about the Palestinian cause. If you look at the campus protests, obviously there's Arabs involved, but you also see a lot of white people, black people, other people of color. So I don't love that when people sort of put that on me. Oh, Shadi, you're just playing a role or whatever, or you're just kind of representing your group. No, I feel very passionately about what's happening to Palestinians. Obviously, I know more about the Palestinian cause because of my Arab background. It's something that we grew up with.
Like the familiarity of it.
Yeah, on the dinner table, I guess lunch table, and it's,
as it were.
Yeah, as it were. So that makes me more familiar, but I don't think that determines my position.
Well, Jason, I want to turn to you here because you have argued in some of your recent columns at the Post that some of this rhetoric is reductive and that the role of identity politics in this debate is not always positive. Here's what you wrote in a recent column, quote, "Dividing groups of people into categories of oppressed and oppressor is a poisonous way to conduct politics in a liberal, multi-ethnic republic." What to you makes identity politics sometimes poisonous in this context?
It's fascinating listening to Shadi's evolution because it's more or less the reverse of the evolution that I hear from a lot of liberal Jews who sort of may have been sympathetic. Shadi was a critic of wokeness, as he put it, and he's become more sympathetic. I hear a lot of liberal Jews say, I was sympathetic to wokeness or to identity politics or to, I was an ally of marginalized groups, and now wait a second, these people who I thought are my allies are protesting against Israel, and I'm a Jewish Zionist, and I support Israel. What's going on with that? Maybe this identity politics coalition that Democrats have built and that I thought I was a part of was not a good idea. That's not me, but that's what I hear a lot from liberal Jews. So I think Shadi, that's another example of the way this conflict has cleaved people. It's changed people's perspective in a lot of ways. I think that, group affinities are natural in politics. They're something that's always going to be around. I mean, there's never been a political system where people don't divide themselves to some extent by groups, and different groups see themselves as having different interests. But I think it's something to be managed. It's a reality of human politics and human relations to be managed. It's probably not a good thing to lean into or to celebrate, because when people can divide themselves, when you have a healthy polity with a strong sense of, an American creed, something that all people can believe in, then they may be less likely to to sort themselves into identity groups. I think when you have sort of that glue, the ideological glue of a society start to weaken, the default is identity-based politics. So I think identity politics can be both a symptom and a cause of political problems, especially in a creedal country like the United States that's not, that has people of all, is the most diverse country in the world.
Well, that's interesting because the idea of American, you're touching on it, that a lot of us who grew up in this country were taught as children. I mean, this is something I heard, I think you heard growing up, was that America is a country that is founded on ideals. It's a country that's united by, it's about ideas. It's not about, our ethnicity or religion. I know there's a lot of conversation about that right now, a lot of debate about that right now. So it makes me want to ask both of you this question of, do we even have shared American values anymore? Are those ideas universal anymore? Is there a common concept of what it means to be an American? Should we be coming to more of a consensus? Because it does feel like there are some fundamental disagreements about what it means to be an American, and I think that's the undercurrent for even this immediate moment of the war that we're talking about. So maybe Shadi, do you want to address that? I'd love to hear what you have to say too, Jason.
Yeah, so I think that in this sort of Trump or post-Trump era that we're in, we as Americans no longer agree on the fundamental questions. So the so-called who we are questions, what it means to be American, the role of religion in public life, the nature of America's founding. These are the deepest issues you can sort of contend with. And I think that we just don't agree on them. I mean, if you go back to the Obama era, we were still debating policy issues, marginal tax rates, health care. Remember when Obama wore that tan suit? That was a huge controversy.
It was a big deal.
So back then, those were the kinds of debates we were having. We weren't yet at the foundational stuff. It was still kind of superficial. And I think that is a shift that's going to stay with us probably for the rest of our lives. And maybe the Obama years and what came before, the sort of triumphalism of the 1990s, where it felt that America, there was a sense of optimism and that we as Americans were moving in the same direction. I think that's gone. And in some ways, America is becoming what a lot of the rest of the world is like. So I was living in the Middle East during a chunk of the Obama years, and what I saw in countries like Egypt and Tunisia, and I'm originally Egyptian, I should say, was that no one was debating policy. Everyone was debating what it means to be an Egyptian, the role of religion in public life. It was all about identity politics. And then I come back to the US in 2014, and then I start to see the same thing. It was almost as if the Middle East was offering up a dark preview of what was to come in America. And so that's been a really fascinating thing for me to see. And we might wish it were otherwise, but I think part of what democracy is, you do need a little bit of polarization. Having deep divisions is good because we don't actually agree on the big questions. So instead of suppressing that and pretending that there's a common good that we can aspire to, what if there isn't a common good that we can aspire to? So on things like, just take abortion, for example, which kind of implicates our deepest convictions about the human person and what is a human person. We can get into a lot of debate and discussion and sit down with the opposite side, but when it comes to what we believe is the human person and what it means to be alive, how are we going to be able to split the middle on that? There isn't really a middle ground on that because that's kind of an existential question. So I think what I would prefer to see is that we sort of accept that this is the new normal. Instead of saying, well, let's come to a common ground, we say, let's learn to live with the people that we dislike, or let's learn to live with the people that we hate, because they're not going anywhere. So there's 74, I'm not a Trump voter, but there's 74 million of them, and they're not going anywhere. So I, as a left of center person, have to say, well, look, we're going to have to find a way to make this work.
But you use the term debate and discussion, which I think is part of the challenge here, that having those debates and having those discussions, especially across an ideological divide or a difference of identity, is challenging and painful, and I think, frankly, a thing in this moment that a lot of people just don't want to do or don't see as worthwhile.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you think about what identity politics or what identity means in a democracy, we want to be able to talk to people no matter what their identity is, and we want to be able to have a debate based on a shared language and reason. And what identity politics, I think, represents is it represents a view that if somebody has a different identity, they can't really understand. They can't understand what I'm saying. And this goes back to the founding. I think in the American founding, the Federalists wanted to have sort of an elite class of natural aristocrats who could find the common good and rule in service of the common interest. And people sort of said, you don't know what I'm going through. You live in a different kind of way than me. You don't understand what someone in my vocation or my religion does. And so identity politics is sort of at the limits of argument, because if you're arguing about your identity, that's not something you can really reason through. So it's really, I think that's why I go back to this being a symptom of, I think, political unraveling to some extent, because it represents, argument reaching its limits, and then we're falling back on our most base affinities.
Do we have to always reason through things? Like going back to the Israel example here, in my close friend group in Washington, D.C., I'm pro-Palestine, in quotation marks. A couple of my close friends are staunchly pro-Israel. We're on opposite sides. What we've decided in that situation is to not talk about it. Because at some basic level, it is something that is very deeply felt. It's very intense for us. So then it's part of our identities. So what can we really do about it? And in some ways, it's better to acknowledge that. And we can maybe respect that the other person is on the opposite side and then just leave it there. I think there's something to be said for leaving things. And instead of always trying to reason and to find where we might intersect or finding a common ground that might not actually be there, I think that if you want to stay close to your friends and preserve the friendship, maybe it's better to not talk too much about it.
That reminds me of post-2016 when there were all these conversations about, can you talk to your Trump-loving uncle or your Hillary-loving aunt? Just don't go there.
I do think that was a big moment for people reassessing this idea of, is debate worthwhile? Is it worth it to have friendships with people who disagree so profoundly with you, maybe because it's across ideological lines, or maybe because the other person has beliefs that feel like in a direct attack on your identity? And I think a lot of people have gotten to this place, and it sounds like, Shadi, you're in a similar place of maybe it's...
But I would say that it is in some ways, maybe it is a direct. It really bothers me that some of my closest friends don't seem to have much sympathy for Palestinians. They're not moved by it. They see a lot of Palestinian civilians being killed in the tens of thousands, and it doesn't register for them emotionally. That's kind of scary to me, right?
So what do you do?
But what I do is I say our friendship is more important. Everyone should be allowed. My new policy is this: everyone should be allowed one or two terrible opinions at any given moment.
Shadi's rules.
Yeah, and we give people grace on that. People are complicated, and they might think the same thing about me. Like, why isn't Shadi more sympathetic to the Jewish state? Why, why doesn't he feel that? Whatever it might be. And so I think it goes both ways, but ultimately relationships are important. And I would like to think that the political isn't always personal and the personal isn't always political, that we're able to cordon things off and say, hey, our friendship has been there for, let's say, a decade, and we've built something as friends. That foundation is there. We're going to let a geopolitical moment end our friendship. That makes me really nervous, because then we're going to have a lot of friendships ending.
No, that's absolutely right, that there has to be limits to to politics in a democracy, but also once you start losing the ability to reason altogether, the way differences are settled is violently. And I mean, democracy means that somebody needs to be arguing over policy to set the policy. That ultimately, and somebody needs to vote and persuade people in enough numbers to come around to their views. So that's my qualification.
And for the record, I think this is why we were so excited to be sitting down with the both of you, because you actually are friends who talk about this stuff in real life and
I
like
guess we're on
engage
opposite
ideas.
sides. I mean, if I can just put you in a box, Jason, if you'll allow me that.
As he's tried to dismantle the box the whole time.
I mean, look, we haven't talked about it a whole lot, but my basic sense is that you're pro-Israel, and you're in a very different position than I am on some of this.
I will say, I mean, when I described how I think Shadi's evolution since the Israel war began, is the opposite from the evolution of many liberal Jews that I know. I'm I'm not religiously, but I'm a Jewish person who's a political conservative. And to me, I have not been surprised by the response to October 7th. I don't see the anti-Israel sentiment that we've seen expressed as somehow a betrayal of progressive politics. I see it as the natural manifestation of progressive politics. I mean, I've seen at this conference there are land acknowledgments about we're on stolen land, the indigenous people own this land. That's basically language that can be used to justify Hamas's point of view, and it's a real point of view out there. But I'm not surprised that a bunch of progressives are incredibly anti-Israel.
Well, it's not also only Hamas's perspective, but yeah, like what you're saying is it's a natural evolution. You're not surprised that in the same way that a lot of liberal Jews are surprised.
Yeah, I don't see the anti-Israel movement as a betrayal of progressive politics. I see it as part of progressive politics. I agree with the progressives protesting on that extent. They're consistent. But so I find that a lot of the Jews and Zionists who are most anguished by this are people who I thought that liberal politics meant supporting Israel, especially Jews who grew up in the 20th century in the era of labor Zionism after World War II and shortly after Israel's creation. I'm pro-Israel, but I'm not surprised or confused by the ideological trends that make people anti-Israel.
And that makes me like progressives more because they are more critical of Israel. I like that. And it was interesting that just like last summer, I was becoming more and more critical of progressives on some of the social and moral issues of our time that I tend to be, I guess, to put my own self in a box.
Might as well, you put it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm vaguely left of center, but I am more socially and religiously conservative than, say, the median Democratic voter. I think it's good for religion to play a role in public life. I see religion as a force for good. It bothers me that the Democratic Party has become less hospitable to people and communities of faith. I think it's become a much more secularized party. I worry about, so there's a lot of things that I was moving in that direction on. I'm like, progressives have views, when it came to things like, LGBT themed, the whole debate that, not to get into this too much, but on things like gender equality and debates over race and whether LGBTQ themed lessons should be in public school at a very young age. I had maybe a little bit of a different view than a lot of progressives. But now I'm like, progressives really get the Palestine thing. Maybe I have to reassess my position. So it's interesting.
Are you in the middle of that right now, reassessing your position on some of these other things?
I like,
Because it's interesting because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like, and forgive me if this is a reduction of you, that once it hit close to home on something for you, that it caused you to rethink these issues that weren't maybe, I don't know, hitting close to home for you, but they were for other people.
Here's what I'm struggling with. I was aligned with some of the quote-unquote anti-woke people a year ago, but now I'm wondering if most of my formerly anti-woke allies are really hardcore pro-Israel and don't seem to have much sympathy for Arabs, Muslims, or Palestinians to kind of paint with a broad brush, is there something about anti-wokeness that makes people like a little bit more callous, a little bit less sympathetic to people who are suffering? Like maybe.
The audience in Seattle says yes.
Yeah. So if that is an impulse, that is at play with some of these people who I was maybe friends with or allied with on some of these issues a year ago, I wish that wasn't the case. I think that you can be critical of identity politics in the ways that Jason is, and not be callous towards people. Like, it doesn't have to be an either or, but what I am finding is that sometimes people are fitting in these kinds of boxes where if you're not very sympathetic to Palestinians, then or to put it the other way around, if you're not very sympathetic to other marginalized communities in the US, that seems to transfer to geopolitics and to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it is forcing me to reckon with this a little bit more with something, and I should say, I wish this wasn't the case, and I'm sort of almost bothered by it. The Israel-Gaza war should not be defining my politics the way that it is, but it feels like such a momentous moment for me. And it also, I think, fits into a lot of domestic debates around campus protests, free speech, the authoritarian tactics that we're seeing when we have university administrators sending state troopers and the police to be to be pretty violent with students. That's making me like, whoa, like there's something darker going on here. And you start to see, if you'll forgive me using this term, the intersectionality of it. Some of these things are...
who are you?
But I want to push a little bit further in that direction and maybe zoom a little bit out from just talking about Israel and Palestine, but that I think a lot of people listening to this will think, we're talking about identity politics like it is a choice one is making in how you communicate and how you think about ideas, when identity politics is often just a reflection of people's experiences in the world. And when you think about these big moments of justice and of truth in the past 5 or 10 years, whether it's the aftermath of George Floyd's killing and the protests, the Me Too movement, that those are often held up as examples of identity politics at work, but I think a lot of people would argue it's just a way of getting people to understand essential truth and a way of advocating for justice. And so I guess my question is, isn't identity politics just a reflection of society and how identity is already at play, whether or not we're giving it a name?
Sure. I mean, like I said, I think there's no society where people's identities aren't relevant and that they don't organize around them and that they don't see themselves through that lens. But like I said, I think it's something to be managed, not something to be pushed to the fore. White identity politics, most people wouldn't like, but I think is in some respects a response.
And has existed since the beginning of this country, or since the beginning of whiteness as a concept, right? Like whether you put a name to it or not, that white identity is a thing that has been there.
But are you
and
saying
isn't
it's
new.
not celebrated in the way that other is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm saying that identity politics it begets identity politics, and that and white. I think with Trump, we've seen the rise of more explicit white identity politics for the last 10 years than we saw in previous decades, and I think you'd be foolish to not see the ways in which that's a response to identity politics on the left to some extent. So I think, sure, we're going to have our identities. I'm not going to, and people are going to organize around them. They always have in America. I mean, our states were founded as sort of different havens for religious persecution. We've had Germans and Irish and Puerto Ricans and Jews and Catholics and Christians, and our whole country is, has existed in the immigration and assimilation and non-assimilation of various groups. So I'm not saying that this isn't a political reality. It is and always will be a political reality. But I think it's, like I said, it's something that needs to be managed, because if we're only dividing ourselves based on our identities, we're not arguing about ideas. Or if we're telling people that, as an X or as a white person, I say this, you're sort of saying that there's a fundamental difference in the ability to participate democratically and represent one another depending on our identities. And I think that is something that we see in Bosnia or in Yugoslavia, or Shadi said, in some Middle Eastern countries, when that gets to an extreme, where that goes, and it's the end of debate. So it's obvious. I'm not under any illusions, but it's a balance that has to be struck.
Yeah, and I think Jason's this is where I do agree with Jason that there are real risks here. I mean, we are on the big ideas stage, so if
Let's throw them out.
Yeah, I mean, so if we have to be able to talk about the bigger questions in a way that is not reductive. So I get really nervous when people start a sentence and they say, as a person of color, as a brown person. If you start a sentence like that, then you're claiming a certain kind of authority that pushes, let's say I'm talking to a white person, then that white person isn't going to be able to engage because I'm claiming that the most important thing is that I'm a person of color, I'm brown, and because he's not that, he doesn't have a place on the table to engage in the conversation. That is the danger when everything gets reduced to who we are. We have to be able to say that there is something more. We have complex identities. We have hyphenated identities. We are all, I think, or most of us, if we are American citizens, we are American. And I think there is a danger in losing sight of something that is foundational, that there is a founding that I think for all of it's, not to get into a big debate about the founding, but there is, I believe that we as Americans should be proud of our founding at some basic level, that the ideals that America stands for are something worth fighting for. I mean, that's one of the reasons that, my parents came here for a reason. And I'm really thankful that I don't live in an authoritarian country like Egypt and that I live here, and we're lucky to live here. So I think there has to be some basic recognition of Americanness if we want to be able to move forward in a society without things turning, I think, dark or overly violent and so forth.
It's interesting you're bringing this up because this is something I've been thinking about a lot, which is, and like the history of this country, it goes back a long way, but in not too distant past too, we have a lot of examples of people calling into question others' Americanness because of these other identities. I mean, this is also the root, in my view, of a lot of Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism. I mean, there's a lot of that, of calling into question one's allegiance to this country because of these other identities. So on the flip side, one could look at this as if we allow space for people to talk about, uphold, celebrate these other identities, it helps widen the idea of what it means to be an American, and that being an American can in fact encompass all of this. But I wonder if it's what you're saying, Jason, where you're suggesting that taken to an extreme, like there has to be some sort of middle ground. Like, how do you find that balance? I don't know. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think there needs to be. I think that there needs to be a balance, and I think, like Shadi said, an American creed is, at least in theory, open to everyone, and it's based on the Constitution. It's based on certain ideas. It's based on certain ways of living our lives, and that has made our country amazing. I mean, there's very few countries that have that kind of ethnic pluralism and that are constitutional republics. And so I think that like I said, identity is going to be an engine for social change, and people are going to organize, but we can't abandon the American creed in exchange for more narrow identities.
But can it encompass these? Can the American identity become broader by encompassing all these other identities? I mean, a very simple example of this would be, and I've talked about it on our show before, that I used to go by like an Americanized name. I didn't really have a choice. My parents said, just go by this name. And then I decided to go by Ellie.
Okay.
Which
Really?
I
I didn't know that.
Oh, Martine's learning about me today. We came all the way out
Elahe is
here.
much better. You're an Elahe, not an Ellie.
Yeah, but I decided to go by my real name, and I had my own journey around it. But one of the initial ideas I had around it was to show that this name is an American name, just like everyone's name up here is an American name, because to be an American can be all these identities. So I think that's where I'm sort of trying to find I like get your point, but I'm trying to understand, like, where is there space for people of all different backgrounds to make a claim and celebrate and inject into the idea of what it means to be an American all of these diverse expressions. But then when does it become so divisive and isolating?
Right. I mean, we're arguing about all of this at a very abstract
Yes, true.
level. I think, you know, at a more practical level, what's happening in our politics is the Democratic coalition is facing a lot of pressure from that sort of theory of the case falling apart, in the sense that, you know, Republicans are winning more and more support from working class blacks and Latinos. And I think, you know, that I think a lot of Republicans thought, wait a second, to win Latino votes, we need to focus on immigration, because that's what Latinos care about. They care about immigration.
Oh, that was the big takeaway from the 2012 election, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And Democrats thought, we are going to dominate among these groups by saying that the Republicans are racist, and as the Republicans do in fact, you know, do a kind of white identity politics. That's not the case. The reverse is happening. You know, as we're seeing more ethnic pluralism in the Republican side, and the Democratic Party is most solid and actually winning more white voters, more upper middle class white voters. So that shows the unpredictable ways that these identities can mix. But I also think, you know, it goes.
And that's a good thing.
Sure, I think it's excellent. I think it's really important that our political parties are not organized only by immutable characteristics. And I think, you know, the Democrats, you know, the way that they hoped that this would all shake out is not shaking out. So I think that's worth reflecting on.
And Democrats shouldn't have a lock on certain minority groups, because they shouldn't take us for granted. The Biden administration, the Democratic Party, shouldn't take Arabs and Muslims for granted, and they're realizing that now, because a lot of Arabs and Muslims are saying that if the policy doesn't change, our unquestioning support for Israel and Biden's seeming lack of empathy for Palestinians, if things like that don't change, then some of us are going to stay home come November. Now, I don't love that, but I think there's something positive where both parties feel that they can try to actually argue and persuade for our votes, that nothing is taken for granted, because that's part of what democracy is about. It's about competing for different votes. And I think what Jason is pointing to is like really fascinating, that it's actually, when I say that I love America, which I sometimes do, it's white liberals who seem kind of like, Shadi, wait, you're actually saying that you love America? We don't say that. But it's actually brown people who relate to me when I say I love America, because they're children of immigrants, many of them, and they get it when I say that. There's a certain pride, because we've seen how our families my parents have become American, how in some sense they've fallen in love with America. And so we don't take that for granted. So I think, and then that just creates these kind of unpredictable, you know, I think developments and alliances where, and it's the same thing, a growing number of Arabs and Muslims, at least before October 7th, were gravitating towards the Republican Party. So I think there's something good about scrambling these identities and surprising people in that way.
I have to say, yesterday, right after I arrived in Seattle, I went to the History Museum, where they happened to be having a citizenship ceremony at the same time. And just like passing by, seeing them call out the names.
Did you cry?
I was really tearing
Yeah.
up, and it was a reminder of, you know, what you're saying, of that, like, as much as this is a moment where I think so many people are reflecting on this country and like whether we're headed in a good or bad direction, and like what does it all mean, and maybe this is a country like based on a mountain of lies and injustices, that like there is something sort of fundamentally that I think as an American you can feel patriotic about, or feel like there is a sense of ideals that even if we're not reaching them, that is like ingrained in at least my identity, and I think a lot of our identities, even if it feels a lot more complicated.
I mean, the good thing about ideals is that they're there even if they're not met. And we have to remember, most other countries aren't founded on ideals. They're founded on, so you're German or you're Swedish or you're Norwegian. Norway is a country of Norwegians. It's not, there isn't this kind of greater aspiration. And we have that, and I think it's very easy to forget that. But the great thing about ideals is that at least they're still possible. And they kind of sit there as a kind of North Star. And I think maybe all of this is corny and basic or whatever, but I think they're real too. And I think a lot of us actually feel them in some fundamental way.
We have to finish in a moment. And so before we leave, I did want to ask both of you, looking ahead to, we're in a campaign year, so we can look to this year ahead, or in the coming years. What is one of the more fascinating developments, or the thing that you're going to be watching when it comes to this sort of like realignment and rethinking of identity? What's the thing that's going to be on your radar that you're tracking? Jason, do you want to start?
Well, I guess what I mentioned before about the political realignment that we're seeing to some extent around race and ethnicity that I think both campaigns are very aware of. I think that, Trump increased his share of the Latino vote significantly between 2016 and 2020. If he increased it again at that same rate, New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, he'd probably win. And I think I'm going to be watching that. And frankly, I'm just going to be pondering on how we got it so wrong. Like you said, in 2012, the Republicans almost did the reverse of what they thought they were supposed to do, or what their most analysts said they were supposed to do after they lost the 2012 election. And it's redounding to their benefit to some extent. I don't actually think that Trump is going to win, but I'm going to watch to what extent that continues, and I'm going to watch to what extent we can keep arguing with each other through ideas and not have violence as we did at the end of the last election.
So Jason just mentioned ideas again, and this Radiohead song just came to mind. It's called Big Ideas, and it goes like, big ideas, don't get any, they're not going to happen. That's like one of the lyrics. It's very dark, but that just came to mind right now.
I just felt like we needed to end with that.
Yeah, you just seem to end on the biggest downer possible.
No, but I do think that part of the reason that Jason and I do what we do, we're writers, is because we do believe in big ideas. They might not happen, but that doesn't mean we can't advocate and write about the things that we believe in. And I think that what makes America great, is that we actually can express our convictions and our beliefs, whether it's religious beliefs or political beliefs, to the full extent, largely without fear of persecution. And we can do that openly in forums like this. And that's a pretty great thing. So, but I do hope that going forward, the Israel-Gaza war sort of subsides a little bit, because I don't actually love where I'm at politically now. Like, I don't want to be completely focused on Israel-Palestine. I want to be able to focus on other things that are important to me. And I'm just finding it hard now, and that's been like a difficult back and forth for me. But there is something about the fact how the Middle East imposes itself on American politics that makes me uncomfortable. And I would like us to get back to a time where the Middle East is not shifting our politics in the way that it is now. Like, it would be sort of weird and kind of a frightening thought that a terrorist organization like Hamas, through their atrocities on October 7th, would have indirectly changed the outcome of an election. Mm-hmm. If so many people decide to vote in a different way because of the Israel-Gaza war, and Democrats lose, I don't want that to happen, but there is a chance Biden might lose because Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, and young progressives decide to stay home because they're angry.
And I think that's
just a crazy idea to think about, and it's unfortunate, but it is a real risk going into November.
And I think we're all going to be watching for that. We're officially out of time, but I just wanted to thank you guys both so much on behalf of Elahe and myself for this very honest conversation. I think it's a model for how people should be talking with each other going forward. So Shadi and Jason, thank you so much. And thank you to all of you here in the audience. If you want to hear more of these types of conversations, Elahe and I co-host Post Reports with the Washington Post. We also have an opinions podcast called Impromptu, this is a great example of the kinds of discussions that you can hear there. So thank you so much for being here, and please continue to support us.
That was Washington Post opinions columnists Shadi Hamid and Jason Willick speaking with Elahe Izadi and Martine Powers at the Cascade PBS Ideas Festival earlier this month in Seattle. Special thanks to the production staff at the Ideas Festival. And if you liked hearing from our newsroom colleagues today, listen to their podcast, Post Reports, where you can hear deep dives into the biggest and most important stories of the day. Find Post reports wherever you listen. And we'll be back Wednesday with a new episode of Impromptu. Stay tuned.